I'm going to pick up in Genesis where I feel like there is a significant meaning behind this part in Genesis and Exodus because it applies to us today. So I'm going to pick up where, Joseph was being sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. I believe that's around Genesis 37. So just at 17 years old, Joseph was taken by the Ishmaelite traders to Egypt. And if you guys remember who the Israelites were, that was Abraham's first son that they should have not had. But because Sarah got impatient, she let him hook up with Hagar, I believe was her name. And that first son happened outside of wedlock. And that really spread that fork in the road for all of that whole culture that went down the Islamic route. But that was who was running Egypt at the time, because that stems from Nimrod and all their idols. But anyways, so the traders to Egypt is where Joseph went, and he was sold to Potiphar, I believe is how you say his name. He was the officer of the Pharaoh. And despite all of Joseph's hardships, he remained faithful to God and found favor in that officer's house, where he was entrusted with great responsibility. However, this officer's wife falsely accused Joseph of trying to assault her, right? Kind of taking advantage of her is what she reported. And he rejected her repeatedly. She was attempting to make advancements on him, as it talked about in Genesis 39. As a result, Joseph was thrown into prison yet again for this. And even there, the Lord was with him. And Joseph soon became known for his wisdom, his integrity, and his ability to interpret dreams and gifts while he was in prison. Matter of fact, they liked him so much in prison is that the guard essentially let him run the prison himself, which I found fascinating. Yeah, so this part of the Bible timeline always fascinates me. Let's see here. Peter Hamlet says, history is full of lies. His story is our cornerstone. Yes, I agree, Peter. It is, they try to retell, the historical timeline for their own narrative. So, so while Joseph was in prison, he encountered the Pharaoh's cupbearer and the chief baker, both who had been imprisoned after a falling out of favor with the king. In Genesis 40, it talks about this. But one night, they each had disturbing dreams, but could not understand the meaning. Seeing their distress, Joseph, who knew a lot about the interpretations that belonged to God, offered to interpret their dreams. The cupbearer dreamed of a vine with 3 branches that budded and bore ripe grapes, which he pressed into the Pharaoh's cup. Joseph explained that this meant the cupbearer would be restored to his position in 3 days. And was encouraged to, that was a favorable interpretation. And then the chief baker eagerly shared his dream with Joseph. Sadly, the news wasn't as favorable. He shared that 3 baskets of bread sat on his head, but birds came and ate from them. Joseph, however, had to deliver a grim prophecy, saying that within 3 days the baker would be executed and his body would be left for the birds. Sadly, as foretold, both dreams came true exactly as Joseph said. Before the cupbearer left, Joseph asked him to remember him and plead his case before the Pharaoh. But the cupbearer forgot about Joseph, leaving him in prison for 2 more years, sadly. In the book of Jasher, Joseph's time in prison was even more trying than what Genesis really records. In that book, it expands into he had really bad suffering and highlights that despite all the trials, Joseph remained unwavering in his faith, continuously ministering to those that are around him. Joseph was even held in chains for a lot of his time in the imprisonment, further illustrating how severe he was treated there. Yet through all of this, God was preparing him for a greater purpose. Then came that moment that changed everything. Pharaoh himself had a troubling dream. He talks about this in Genesis 41. In one dream, he saw 7 fat cows emerge from the Nile, only to be devoured by 7 thin, sickly cows. In another one, he saw 7 healthy heads of grain swallowed up by 7 withered ones. None of the Egypt's magicians or wise men could interpret the dreams, leaving Pharaoh really desperate for answers. It was then the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph and told Pharaoh about the Hebrew prisoner who had accurately predicted his dream 2 years earlier. So Joseph was immediately summoned before Pharaoh. But before appearing, he was shaved and given fresh clothes, as it was customary before meeting the ruler. When asked if he could interpret the dreams, Joseph humbly stated, "It's not me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer," mentioned in Genesis 41. He then explained that both dreams carried the same message. God was revealing what he was about to do. Egypt would experience 7 years of great abundance, followed by 7 years of severe famine. This famine would be so devastating that it would consume everything the years of plenty had produced. Joseph advised the Pharaoh that he needed to really find someone that knew what they were doing, to administer storing the grain and making sure to ensure their survival. Pharaoh and his advisors were pretty impressed by Joseph's wisdom and recognized that the Spirit of God was within him. Pharaoh then made a decision to elevate Joseph from prisoner to the second most powerful man in Egypt in a single day. Essentially, he went from prisoner to governor. Only one over top of him was the Pharaoh. That's talking about a blessing. They dressed him up and, he got everything. He went from prisoner to head of the state. Joseph was appointed as Pharaoh's governor, given the authority over all of the land, clothed in royal garments. He was also given his insignia ring that the Pharaoh took off his hand, and then given the Pharaoh's daughter as his wife. And she later had 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Including Midrash, it indicates that Joseph's rise to power was not just a political appointment, but a divine setup, because God was orchestrating these events that would eventually lead to the salvation of Israel. And that's what we're seeing unfold. As predicted, 7 years of abundance followed, during which Joseph oversaw the storage of, just vast amounts of grain. And then as the famine began, Egypt alone is the only one that had food. And essentially everybody from every surrounding nation showed up buying grain. It got to the point where all the surrounding nations gave every dollar, gave every animal. It got so bad that there was no more animals left to give and no more money left to give, that they were selling their land and themselves into slavery in order to get food. This was how bad it was. The famine was so bad that essentially all of Egypt collected all of the money in the world because they were feeding the surrounding world. They ended up with all the livestock of the surrounding world. And this is all by Joseph's doing. They collected all the land because the people ran out of money, ran out of livestock, and then was giving them land in order to eat. And then when they ran out of land, they sold themselves into slavery so they could eat. And during this, Joseph's own family showed up to seek relief. Joseph's brothers, who, sold him into slavery, show up and to buy grain. And in a series of carefully orchestrated events, Joseph tested them to see if they had changed from the men who once betrayed him. Eventually, he revealed himself to his family, and it was a really emotional moment, declaring to them, "I am Joseph. asking them if his father was still alive. His brothers were just overcome with shock and guilt, and they really feared retaliation. But Joseph reassured them, recognizing God's sovereignty in the entire ordeal, pretty much telling his brothers, hey, look, this was supposed to happen. This was part of God's divine plan, and there's a bigger picture. And this just reminds me what, the enemy thinks is meant for evil, God will turn it around for the good. And this happens all the time. We see this happen all the time, and I often will reflect on how the World Wide Web was designed for the beast system. But God, again, will take something meant for evil and use it for his kingdom. Because look at all the ministries and all the communities that have come together to give the glory to him based off of the beast system. I mean, it's incredible to witness the glory of God and how his divine plan plays out with such precision. With such precision. It's just truly incredible. It's truly incredible to see the precision of the way the Lord works, guys. It really is. So the Pharaoh invited Jacob, Joseph's father, and his entire household to migrate into Egypt, essentially allowing them to pick wherever they want to live because of Joseph. So they ended up in Goshen. Talks about this in Genesis 47. And in the book of Jasher, the Jewish traditions meant that Goshen was one of the most fertile regions, allowing the Israelites to really thrive. And for years, for generations, they lived in peace, growing into an incredibly a massive nation. So for several generations, the Israelites flourished in Egypt, growing into they grew into just a mighty amount of people. However, after Joseph's death and the Pharaoh that knew, the family, a new Pharaoh arose who did not know about Joseph and the history. In Exodus 1:8, this ruler started to really fear the growing numbers of the Israelites because they were outnumbering the Egyptians on a staggering amount. I think when the Israelites left, just the men alone was 600,000 men. That's not the women or the children. There was 600,000 grown men in the Israelite group. I forget the actual percentage difference, but there was a massive, massive difference in the size of the people. And this really, intimidated the new Pharaoh. But as we will see, this was all part of God's divine plan to display his glory, to show his sovereignty. But there's even more to it that I'm starting to realize, as what is happening in Egypt is also a foreshadowing of what is happening today. So this ruler, fearing the increasing numbers and the strength of the Israelites, he enslaved them and subjugated them to just harsh labor. The Israelites, they suffered greatly under this new ruler's bondage, forced to build cities like Ramses and Pithom, and it talks about this in Exodus 1:11. In a brutal attempt to control their population, Pharaoh ordered that all Hebrew male infants be drowned in the Nile River. Talks about this in Exodus 1:22. It was during this dark time that Moses was born, Exodus 2. His mother, I believe her name is Jochebed. I'm horrible with names. Hid him for 3 months and then placed him in a basket on the Nile, where he was found and adopted by the Pharaoh's daughter and raised as an Egyptian prince. Moses later discovered his Hebrew identity And in a fit of rage, when he saw an Egyptian that was literally manhandling a Hebrew, he killed him. So, I know I cut some corners off the story. I just don't want to get too long-winded into this. I realized that, Moses' biological mother, was giving back the baby to nurse, and feed him. And I'm just kind of trimming time off this. So he had to flee, not to really shave time off the story, because Moses had a really incredible position. There's a lot more to the story. I just don't want to spend too much time on it. But Moses, like Joseph, rose to be a very significant person under the Pharaoh. But anyways, after he killed that Egyptian, he had to flee for his life. So he escaped to Midian, where he met Zipporah, I believe is how you pronounce her name. I don't think I got it right. But anyways, he went there and married and became a shepherd. Talks about this in Exodus 2:11. So he was there for quite a while. I think like 40 years. And then Moses encountered God in the burning bush account. Talked about Exodus 3. The Lord commanded him to return to Egypt and to lead the people out of slavery. Despite his initial reluctance, he gave him all sorts of reasons why he couldn't. He was bad with words, and, God had him display his, power by throwing his staff on the ground and it turned to a snake, this and that. But again, I'm just kind of shaving time off of this. Despite this initial reluctance, he caved, So he went and talked to the Pharaoh. And, God said that he would harden Pharaoh's heart and not, accept the Israelites from leaving. So God sent 10 devastating plagues into Egypt, one by one. These plagues systematically demonstrated God's power over Egypt and over Egypt's gods, because at first, I think it was the first 2 or 3 plagues, the Pharaoh's magicians were able to duplicate them. Like when the Isle was turned into blood, the magicians were able to do the same thing. But I think it stopped after only 1 or 2 of them. But it got bad. He had swarms of frogs, flies, disease on livestock, boils, hail that destroyed their crops, locusts that came and completely finished off their crops. They had darkness that came over the land for 3 days. And what was crazy is in Goshen, there was no darkness. So all of Egypt was in darkness except for Goshen had normal daylight. And finally, the mother of all of them was the death blow to the firstborn. And this is what sent the Pharaoh over, the final plague, which took all the lives of the firstborn Egyptians. So it led Pharaoh to finally relent, allowing the Israelites to leave. And this was the institution of the Passover, as talked about in Exodus 12. And it marked this event as God instructed all the Israelites to place blood of the lamb on their doorposts so the angel of death would pass over their homes. When we sit here and reflect on that first Passover, do you guys realize how significant that Passover was and what it means to us now? It's really incredible when you look back at Scripture and read these stories as your eyes and your spiritual eyes develop through that relationship with Christ. How each time we read these, it becomes, the stories, at least for me, they become more magical. It's really incredible to reread these historical stories. I'm not sure if it has that same impact on you. Maybe it's just me because I love the historical element to these stories. But every time I reread these stories, it impacts me greatly because I reflect on these things. Again, I had read Genesis and Exodus a few years ago, and it didn't have that big of an impact on me. I guess just because through time, as the more you develop that relationship with God, the more you desire the word. Where I think a few years ago, I was almost a baby Christian, because in 2020 was when I had my eyes opened. And, 2020, 2021, at the time, it may have even felt forced to read through the scripture. As many of you know, as you're developing that relationship, at the beginning, sometimes it can feel like a forced habit, and you have to really push through that. So, if you are in that position where if you're somewhat new and you feel like you're having to force yourself into the scriptures, just stick with it, because it's not abnormal. I remember when I felt like a baby Christian, I did have to force myself into the scriptures. But as that relationship matures, the more you'll desire that stuff. As I remember reading the scriptures for the first time, I took it in, but again, as my spiritual eyes had really not developed a lot yet, it was more just ingesting it. And each time I read the scriptures now, it has more significance to me. It impacts me. It's especially now. Especially now. So, let's see, where did I leave off? Okay, so the Israelites left Egypt. Pharaoh, of course, changed his mind and pursued them with his army. And to make a long story short, the Israelites were on the beaches of the Red Sea. And luckily, the Lord was with them, and he kept the army divided from the Israelites, because there was a lot of Israelites. Remember, there was 600,000 men, and they brought all their livestock, their children, and the wives. So if there's 600,000 men, there was probably 3 or 4 million total, I would guess. That's a lot of people. And they were all gathered on that beachhead. Luckily, God was able to put a pillar of fire between them and the Egyptian army. And this was when we, that miracle, that moment in scripture that always leaves me in awe, because, I reflect on Ron Wyatt's findings of finding the chariot wheels. And this is when Moses, with the staff, literally God parted the Red Sea through Moses. And this allowed the Israelites to cross on dry ground. Literally crossed on dry ground. And understand that the walls of water on each side of them were still several hundred feet high. Imagine walking through that path and seeing the walls of water so high on each side of you. I mean, just how amazing. So then after the the Israelites made it to the beaches on the other side, the Egyptian forces, they were chasing them. But God collapsed the walls of water once the Israelites made it ashore and drowned all of the Egyptian forces that pursued after them. I think there were 600 chariots that were pursuing them. I mean, Pharaoh took his entire military in pursuit. I know that it was 600 chariots that went into the Red Sea crossing. I'm not sure if, he took all of his other soldiers and whatnot. And I'm not sure if Pharaoh was part of the chariots pursuing them. I can't remember if it talks about that or not. But nevertheless, there was 600 of his finest chariots that were pursuing the Israelites across the Red Sea crossing. And this event was just incredible. This event marked the end of the 400 years of oppression and the beginning of their journey towards the promised land. Again, I reflect on what Ron Wyatt discovered, as I'm sure many of you have watched the footage of those incredible findings when they scuba dived down to the bottom of the Red Sea and found the chariot wheels and the bones of animals and just all those incredible things littered along the path that the Israelites walked across. And what's even more incredible about the Ron Wyatt findings is back then in the late 70s, they rented a plane. And that's how they found it, because while they were flying in the air above, they were able to see the only path that the Israelites could have taken through the mountain with that many people. And then they found the beachhead, which later archaeologists found a post that Constantine put up marking that beachhead, which is even more incredible. But I reflect on that Red Sea crossing and everything that Ron Wyatt found, and it just leaves me in just awe and amazement. As many of you know, that I really enjoyed watching Ron Wyatt's work, and especially meeting his brother. Matter of fact, his brother, True Lady Liberty, and I were at one of their events not too long ago, and they gave this to us. She has one as well. I don't think it's in a box, though, but this is a brimstone found at the Sodom and Gomorrah site that he collected. For me, the historical element to the story is really my favorite, because it leaves me in awe thinking about the historical element, and that the Bible is true in everything that it says. Every bit of it is true. True Lady Liberty Israel trip, yes. I'm sorry, love. I know you've asked me several times to commit to an Israel trip. I would love to, honey. I don't mean to drop the ball on that. Did you say we can go yet? Yes, we can go. I just don't know when we can go, honey. But I'm good with it. Laney says, I don't think he did, though, according to history. Yeah, I would have to look a little closer to see if the Pharaoh was a part of those 600 chariots. I can't remember. But I just find it incredible that historical element. Honey, yes, I know you want to go. It is incredible. It would be just absolutely incredible to go out to Israel and literally go to all these sites and see and reflect on the history. I can only imagine how magical of a moment it is to be standing in those places where history was formed and marked. You know, I've never had the pleasure or the luxury to go and spend time in those places, which is, funny enough, a surprise, because for the wedding industry that I did for 2 decades, I went everywhere in the world except there. Go figure. But it would just be incredible, especially to be there with you, True Lady Liberty. Yes, you don't harass me. You just ask. And I know how bad you want to go, and I want to go as well. But it's thinking about that time period, just the story itself, it has significant meaning, because the story of Egypt's rise and fall is all tied to the influence of God's people. Think about what spiritual significance this carries, because it reveals a divine principle of God, how favor, judgment, deliverance, and sovereignty are all tied together. Because think about it. Egypt initially thrived under Joseph, a man chosen by God who governed with wisdom, integrity, and divine guidance. Under his leadership, Egypt not only survived a devastating famine, but became the global superpower by accumulating every bit of wealth on the planet. It was the only nation that had food. And again, all the surrounding nations gave them all their money, all their livestock, all their land, and eventually gave themselves just to eat. It's an incredible story. But this prosperity was not a result of any Egyptian gods or the Pharaoh's wisdom, but rather the direct blessing of God working through his servant. It stands as a testament to how nations and leaders who submit to God's wisdom will experience his provision, his stability, and the success. And then we can see how the shift from favor to downfall occurred when Egyptian turned against the very people through who God had brought them prosperity. Think about it. So there was a new leader appointed, a new Pharaoh. And this represents that spiritual shift, a transition from divine blessing to rebelling against God's plan. This Pharaoh who feared the Israelites and led to the oppression, mirroring how darkness reacts when it sees the children of God thriving. Do you guys see the correlation of where I'm going with this? This shift reflects a broader spiritual pattern. When a nation or the rulers forget God and choose to oppress his people, judgment follows. Egypt's downfall was not an overnight event. It began with the rejection of God's chosen people, and it escalated through stubbornness, idolatry, and defiance of God. Instead of recognizing the continued presence of God's favor amongst the Israelites, Pharaoh saw them as a threat. His oppression of God's people was not only merely political, but a spiritual war against God's divine plan. The Pharaoh's resistance to releasing the Israelites despite the plagues is symbolic of the hardening of the human heart against God's will. With each act of rebellion, Egypt suffered more, showing that when people repeatedly reject divine warnings, their downfall becomes inevitable. This is a principle seen throughout history. When rulers and nations or individuals persist in opposing God, they bring judgment upon themselves. Pharaoh's refusal to submit to God's command led the ultimate judgment, the death of the firstborn and the destruction of his army in the Red Sea. The very sea that was a pathway to freedom for God's people became the grave for those who opposed him. This serves as a powerful reminder that what God intends for deliverance will become the destruction for those who resist him. Spiritually, the Exodus represents the journey from bondage to freedom, not just for Israel, but for all who follow God. Egypt symbolizes the worldly system that enslaves God's people. Just as sin enslaves humanity, Pharaoh is a representation of the enemy, Satan, who refuses to release those he holds captive. The plagues, culminating in the death of the firstborn, it foreshadows Jesus Christ, the true firstborn, whose death will ultimately free mankind from bondage of sin. The crossing of the Red Sea is a picture of the baptism and the spiritual rebirth, where the old life, Egypt and slavery, is left behind and a new life begins in the freedom of God's promise. Furthermore, the destruction of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea represents the final defeat of those who oppose God's people. Just as Pharaoh's forces were swallowed up, so too will all the powers that stand against God eventually will fall. It is a warning to all nations and individuals alike, Aligning against God's will leads to the inevitable destruction. Egypt, which was once a thriving empire under the influence of God, yet when it turned against God, it became an example of divine judgment that echoed throughout history. But, ultimately, this was all part of God's divine plan. It illustrated his absolute sovereignty, his dominance. He is the creator. He is the God, the only God of gods, King of all kings. He will allow nations to rise and fall, using them as instruments in his greater purpose. Egypt's prosperity under Joseph shows that God's presence brings a blessing, while Egypt's downfall under the rebellious leader shows that rejecting God leads to utter destruction. The Exodus was not just about freeing Israel. It was about demonstrating to the entire world that God alone is in control and that he fights for his people and that no earthly power can stand against him. This truth remains till today. Those who trust in God will walk through the waters of deliverance, while those who oppose him will ultimately face the weight of his divine justice. We can see it happening again in our own nation. We are at that pivotal point where we are reaching the precipice. Will our nation turn back to God? Or will it follow the path of Egypt? Time will tell, Time will tell. True Lady Liberty says, Christopher does intermediate fasting. If I'm not careful, will starve me by accident. No, honey. I found that intermediate fasting just reprograms your metabolism as long as you eat in the evening. But, the key to that is not taking in the carbs and breads in the evening. I found the best way was to just eat meats and vegetables and protein type stuff. Oh, you weren't asking me. Sorry, honey. Christopher does intermediate fasting. And if I'm not careful, he will starve me by accident. Yes. I am definitely... Yeah, we will be together, and I'm so used to not eating. And I'll look at her, and she's like, what's wrong? I'm hungry. I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot about food. I'm sorry, honey. I don't mean to. It's been a habit for so long. I feel bad. Yeah, I understand. I definitely have to be more mindful of that. All right, so there's more to it. There is more to what I have to say, but I'm going to show something real quick because that was just the first half. I want you guys to check this out. Pay attention to this. This is very interesting. You'll see where I'm going with this because it's related to Egypt.
Exact alignment will happen in 2026 at Easter.
What will happen?
The alignment she told me about, that the star of Regulus would be on the horizon in front of the Sphinx. At that moment, there'd be a new knowledge. Well, I had no idea if this was even possible, but these astronomers run it through the machines, and it comes out that star is going to come up on the horizon in Easter of 2026. And from that point forward, they started remote viewing the state. Government did. And now you hear it all over TV. 2026, that's the big date. 2027, that year, something's going to happen. Armageddon, you hear it all over. You hear it on TV. If you study, I've heard even, well, I won't say names, but,
Please do.
well, you know Lou Elizondo, right? Lou's mentioned that date. A lot of people have.
Easter 2026.
Well, the year 2026. I gave him the specific time. And it was with Robert Grant that I told him about this alignment and all. And then he's like, oh my God. He's been looking for this ruby, this little ruby you have to find and place it between the paws of the Sphinx to make this event that he knows is going to happen in 2026. I said, Robert, it's not a ruby, it's the Star of Regulus. He looks like, he's like, oh my God, that's the King's Star. So what's going to happen, I don't know. But I think it's possible that's the return of
Christ.
Yeah. Or the lady and the whole heavenly host living with us, Jesus. That's the first time I've ever said that in my life, publicly. You're the first.
Pretty significant what he's saying. Pretty significant. As through my research, I've read that, and this was interesting, that the Stargate project was a secret U.S. military project established in 1977 at Fort Meade in Maryland by the Defense Intelligence Agency. And this SRI International was investigating these psychic phenomenons, and the military got very good at this application. The primary focus of this project was remote viewing. And most of you understand what the ability is with remote viewing, as they got really good at it. They would gain information from really anywhere in the world, and they could even look into the future. And this is what fascinates me the most. Anyways, in 1995, this project called Stargate saw something extremely significant, and command leadership shut down the project and terminated it in 1995 for what they saw. Now, from my research and understanding, it wasn't shut down, it was just moved off the books into a black site sector. Now, what's even more interesting is now we have the Stargate initiative announced by our current president this year, was reported to focus on merging artificial intelligence infrastructure into this project. So from what I understand, this will merge quantum AI into this black site original project with the intention to expand remote viewing capability. Now, publicly, they're announcing this is a new project, and its plan is to establish, data centers, starting with an initial investment of like 100 to 500 billion that could grow to like 7 trillion. And they talk about the reason they're doing this is because it'd create over 100,000 jobs. And this current explanation includes venture capitalists in collaboration with like OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle, MGX. But I think this is just a cover story because that's what's being said to cover their reasons. But it's interesting that the press doesn't report on the Stargate project that was developed in 1977, which was a remote viewing project. So there is an upcoming celestial event that this man was talking about in that video. This is an alignment that happens on Easter in 2026, which presents a really fascinating connection to biblical prophecy, specifically regarding the return of our King. Throughout history, God has used signs in the heavens to communicate with his people. From the Star of Bethlehem, announcing Christ's birth in Matthew 2:2, to the prophetic blood moons and the celestial disturbances described in the end times in Luke 21. So this alignment is with the star Regulus, which is the heart of Leo. And this sign will align with the Great Sphinx of Gaza on March 20th, 2026. So for me, this holds a spiritual significance. It could mean more than just the return of Christ. I could be totally wrong. It could mean anything, including maybe even the rapture or, the revealing of anything. Something majorly prophetic is what they're predicting, but it's not out of the question of what I initially mentioned. So if we examine this alignment through the lens of scripture and prophecy and historical patterns, we understand that we'll never know the exact hour of Christ's return, as it's pretty clear in scripture. But scripture does call for us to discern the signs of the times and be spiritually prepared, as it mentions in Matthew 24. The Bible tells us that the stars, the sun, the moon have been used for markers in divine history all throughout time. Again, one of the most famous examples is that star in Bethlehem, which signaled the birth of Jesus Christ. The Magi, who were scholars of these ancient celestial patterns, recognized this unusual alignment for the coming Messiah. This tells and demonstrates us that God has historically used signs in the stars as prophetic indicators. In Joel 2:30 it says, "And I will show wonders in the heavens on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." In Luke 21, it says, "There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring signs of the tossing sea. People will faint from terror, apprehension of what is coming on the world. For in the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in the cloud with his power and great glory." What's significant is in 2017, we had the Revelations 12 sign, that woman clothed with the sun prophecy, which to me and a lot of people, this marked the beginning of the end time countdown, because that was that Revelations 12 sign in 2017. From my understanding, that has not happened before. Now, it could be wrong, but that's just my understanding. So I think about it because this star alignment with the Sphinx is called the heart of the lion. And this all ties back to Egypt, which has held prophetic significance from the dawn of time. The Sphinx faces eastward toward the rising sun. This is the posture that suggests a connection to celestial movements and markers for significant events. Think about it. The Sphinx, it's a fusion of two powerful biblical symbols. It's a lion, which represents, in my mind, Christ as the Lion of Judah, Revelations 5:5, a symbol of divine kingship and messianic authority. And then it has a human face, the Virgo, which could represent Jesus as a man, signifying the coming Redeemer through human lineage. Regulus, the star, it's known as the heart of lion in the constellation of Leo. It's one of 4 royal stars of ancient times and has been historically linked to ruler, divine authority, prophetic kingship. So it's compelling to me that this could be marked something as it aligns with the Star of Bethlehem 2,030 years prior. You know, we know that the stars, the sun, the moon, everything is preceded by signs in the heaven. So could this Star of Regulus aligning with the Sphinx that heralds the line of Judah, could that mark or tell us something about our King's return? You know, I'm just speculating, guys. I'm just speculating. Because the timing of this alignment on Easter Sunday is another critical factor to consider. You know, Easter represents the resurrection of Jesus Christ, a cornerstone of our faith, marking his victory over sin and death. You know, the Bible repeatedly speaks of a second coming in which Christ will return not as a suffering servant, but as a conquering king to establish his millennial reign. You know, many have speculated that his return could align with one of the biblical feast days or a significant observance. You know, think about Easter 2026. It's a divine marker. Between feast days, you know, the Bible frequently speaks of signs in the heavens as indicators. Jesus himself said there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars, and on the earth distressing amongst nations. The book of Revelation describes a time when the sun will turn dark and the moon will turn to blood and the stars will fall from the sky. You know, these signs are meant to warn us of the approaching day of the Lord. You know, as celestial events unfold and align with Bible prophecy, it really is our duty to stay spiritually alert and discern what is happening in the skies. You know, because God put these markers there in the sky for a reason. You know, it raises even deeper questions in my mind because of the year 2026. As I reflect on the prophetic significance of Israel's rebirth in 1948. You know, the parable of a fig tree mentions the countdown to the final generation, saying that the generation that sees Israel's rebirth will see everything all fulfilled, meaning this is the biblical generation that will see all prophecy fulfilled in the return of our King. And in the Bible, a generation is interpreted between 70 and 80 years in Psalms 90:10. So 2026 falls within that window, which is even more interesting. Another key aspect to consider is the role of judgment in biblical prophecy. Just as Egypt thrived under Joseph but fell into judgment when it turned against God's people, history shows that nations rise and fall based off of their relationship with God. Think about what 2026 could signify. You know, there has been clear signs of wars and rumors of wars because the last century was the very first time we have had global wars. World War I, World War II, the whole world was at war. We have the moral decay, a dramatic increase in lawlessness. You know, so the stage is literally set. You know, what is important for us is to stay rooted in Scripture. I know I beat this over your guys' head every day, that we are to focus on that daily, intimate relationship with God.